The floorboards above her head groaned with the weight of dying wolves. Lyra pressed her small hands against her mouth, tasting copper and ash. Through the gaps in the wooden planks, she could see boots, massive, black leather stained with blood that wasn't their own. The iron-fang wolves moved through her home like shadows given flesh, silent except for the wet sounds of their work. Her mother had shoved her down here when the howls first echoed across the valley. "Stay hidden," she'd whispered, her amber eyes wild with terror. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you smell." But Lyra could smell everything. The metallic tang of spilled blood, the acrid smoke beginning to curl through the walls, the musk of foreign wolves, predators who didn't belong in Vale territory, who had come not to claim but to erase. A body hit the floor directly above her hiding spot. The impact sent dust raining down into her dark hair, and she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. The taste of her own blood mixed with the ash coating her throat. Through the cracks, she watched her father's hand fall into view. His fingers were still twitching. The boots stepped over him without pause. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's lullabies, but all she could hear was the crackle of flames beginning to devour the only home she'd ever known. The cellar grew hot, then hotter. Sweet moon, they were burning everything. She pressed deeper into the corner, making herself as small as possible. 11 years old, and already she understood that the world could end in a single night. That safety was an illusion, that even the strongest pack could fall to sharper teeth and colder hearts. The sounds above grew distant. The boots moved on to other rooms, other deaths. But the fire remained, hungry and growing. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards, and Lyra knew she would die here if she didn't move soon. She waited until the footsteps faded entirely, until the only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the whisper of flames claiming everything she'd ever loved. When she finally pushed open the hidden panel and crawled out, her world had become ash and bone. The great room where her family had shared meals and stories was nothing but smoke and ruin. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, her cousins, her aunts, the elderly wolves who had taught her to track and hunt and laugh. All of them still. All of them gone. She found her parents in their bedroom. They had died protecting each other. Her father's body curved around her mother's, his claws still extended. Her mother's face was peaceful despite the blood, as if she had found some last moment of grace before the end. Lyra knelt beside them, her small hands shaking as she touched her mother's cooling cheek. The woman who had sung her to sleep, who had bandaged her scraped knees, who had promised that the pack would always keep her safe. Lies. All of it had been lies. She stayed there until dawn, painted the devastation in shades of gold and crimson, until the last of the flames died and left only smoke and silence, until something hard and sharp crystallized in her chest where her heart used to be. When she finally stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, she walked to the center of what had been her home. She knelt in the ashes of her family and pressed her palms to the blackened floor. The words came from some deep place she hadn't known existed. Not a child's promise, but a vow spoken in blood and witnessed by the dead. "I will find them." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I will find the wolves who did this. I will learn their names, their faces, their fears, and when I am strong enough, when I am ready." She lifted her face to the sky, where smoke still rose like prayers to an indifferent moon. "I will burn them all." The wind carried her words into the morning, and somewhere in the distance, a raven cried its approval. In the ashes of the innocent, vengeance plants its first seed. 10 years had sharpened Lyra Vale into a blade. She moved through the moonless forest like smoke given form, her footsteps silent on the carpet of dead leaves. The witches had taught her well, how to breathe without sound, how to kill without hesitation, how to bury the broken child so deep that even she sometimes forgot the girl had ever existed. Again, Morwen's voice cut through the darkness, sharp as winter wind. The eldest of the 3 witches who had found Lyra, wandering the burned ruins of her home, stood 30 paces away, barely visible in her tattered black robes. In her gnarled hands, she held a wooden target painted with the crude outline of a wolf. Lyra's fingers found the throwing knife at her belt without conscious thought. The blade sang through the air and buried itself in the target's throat with a wet thunk. Better. Morwen's praise was grudging. But an alpha's reflexes are faster than wood and paint. You hesitate for a heartbeat too long. I don't hesitate. The words came out harder than Lyra intended. She'd spent 10 years learning to control her emotions, to cage them like wild things. But sometimes they still escaped. Morwen's laugh was like breaking glass. Child, I can smell your doubt from here. You think yourself ready, but readiness is earned in blood, not practiced on targets. Lyra retrieved her knife, cleaning the blade on her leather breeches. The witches had dressed her in black from the beginning. Black for mourning, black for shadow, black for the darkness she would bring to her enemies. She had grown into the color and felt like a second skin. Then give me something that bleeds. The words hung between them, heavy with promise and threat. Morwen studied her with eyes like chips of obsidian, and Lyra forced herself to remain still under that ancient gaze. She had learned, sometimes painfully, that the witches respected strength but despised impatience. Very well. Morwen turned and began walking deeper into the forest, her robes rustling like dry leaves. Come, your sisters wait. They found Vera and Nyx in the sacred grove where Lyra had spent countless nights learning the darker arts. Vera, beautiful and cruel, leaned against an oak tree with her arms crossed. Nyx, silent and deadly, sat cross-legged on a flat stone, sharpening a curved dagger with methodical precision. Between them, bound with silver chains that burned his supernatural flesh, knelt a wolf. He was young, perhaps 20, with brown hair matted with sweat and golden eyes wide with terror. A rogue, Lyra realized, one of the packless wolves who roamed between territories, surviving on scraps and desperation, the kind of wolf nobody would miss. Your final test, Morwen said, settling herself on a fallen log like a queen taking her throne. Kill him. Lyra approached the bound wolf slowly, studying him as she would any opponent. He smelled of fear and pine sap, of nights spent sleeping rough and days spent running. When their eyes met, she saw her own reflection in his pupils, a young woman with pale skin and dark hair, beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers were beautiful. Please, he whispered, his voice cracked and desperate. I haven't done anything. I don't even know why I'm here. The knife was in her hand before she consciously decided to draw it. Vera and Nyx watched with interest. Morwen's expression remained impassive, unreadable as stone. Lyra knelt beside the wolf, close enough to smell the salt of his tears. What's your name? Thomas. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Thomas Greycliff. My pack was killed by hunters 2 winters ago. I've been alone since then. I never hurt anyone, I swear it. Another orphan. Another survivor of violence and loss. For a moment, Lyra felt something stir in the deep place where she'd buried her humanity. Recognition, perhaps. Kinship. She crushed it ruthlessly. The strong survive, she said, repeating one of Morwen's favorite lessons. The weak feed the earth. Thomas's eyes went wide with understanding. You don't have to do this. You have a choice. No. Lyra placed the knife against his throat, feeling his pulse flutter against the steel. I made my choice 10 years ago. The blade slid across his skin like water, precise and clean. Thomas's blood was warm against her hands, and she watched the light fade from his golden eyes with the same detachment she might observe a sunset. When it was finished, she stood and turned to face the witches. Vera smiled with genuine approval. Nyx gave a small nod of respect. Morwen's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her ancient eyes. Good. Morwen rose from her makeshift throne, moving with surprising grace for someone who had seen centuries come and go. You have learned our lessons well, child. The time has come to put them to use. She reached into her robes and withdrew a scroll sealed with black wax. The seal bore the image of a broken moon, the witch's mark of death. Kael Draven, Morwen said, her voice carrying the weight of pronouncement. Alpha of the Iron Fang Pack, son of the wolf who burned your family, your final target. Lyra's fingers closed around the scroll, and she felt the last piece of her childhood crumble to dust. She had trained for this moment, dreamed of it, lived for it. Everything else had been preparation. When do I leave? Morwen's smile was sharp as winter. Tonight, his fortress lies 3 days' journey to the north. You will go as a healer. They will not suspect a woman bearing medicine and mercy. She paused, studying Lyra's face with those pitiless eyes. Kill him within the month, or do not bother returning. Lyra tucked the scroll inside her cloak and felt the weight of her destiny settle around her shoulders like a shroud. 10 years of training, 10 years of waiting, 10 years of sharpening herself into the perfect weapon. The broken child in the cellar had made a promise in blood and ash. Tonight, the woman she had become would finally keep it. Death walked north on silent feet, carrying vengeance like a prayer. The Iron Fang fortress rose from the mountainside like a scar against the sky. Lyra stood at the edge of the tree line, her healer's satchel weighing heavy on her shoulder, and studied the stronghold that had haunted her dreams for 10 years. Black stone walls climbed toward jagged peaks, broken only by narrow windows that watched the valley like predatory eyes. Torches flickered along the battlements, casting dancing shadows that made the fortress seem alive, a sleeping beast that might wake at any moment. She had imagined this place 1,000 times, but the reality was both more and less than her nightmares had conjured. More imposing, certainly. The sheer scale of it spoke of power accumulated over generations, of an alpha who ruled not through charisma alone, but through the promise of unbreakable strength. Less monstrous, perhaps. She had expected something twisted and dark, a reflection of the evil that had destroyed her family. Instead, she saw craftsmanship in the stonework, beauty in the way the towers caught the last rays of sunlight. It was a place that could have been home to anyone. That somehow made it worse. State your business. The guard's voice startled her from her reverie. He had approached without sound, a skill that marked him as more than human. His eyes, pale as winter ice, studied her with professional suspicion. "I am Mira Thornfield," she said, offering the false name like a gift. "A traveling healer. I carry medicines for the winter fever that has struck the eastern settlements." It was a carefully crafted lie, built on a foundation of truth. The fever was real enough. She had encountered its victims on her journey north. The medicines in her satchel would genuinely help, should anyone choose to examine them. The witches had taught her that the best deceptions were anchored in reality. The guard's nostrils flared slightly as he scented her. Lyra forced herself to remain calm, trusting in the herbs she had rubbed into her skin to mask her true nature. To his senses, she would smell fully human, weak, harmless, useful. "The Alpha sees all petitioners at sunset," he said finally. "You may wait in the courtyard." She followed him through the massive gates, acutely aware of the weight of concealed weapons beneath her healer's robes. The courtyard beyond was larger than her entire childhood village had been, filled with wolves going about their evening tasks. Children played near a fountain while their mothers watched with protective eyes. Warriors sparred in the training yards, their movements fluid and deadly. Servants hurried between buildings carrying food and supplies. It looked almost normal, peaceful even. Lyra found a bench near the fountain and settled herself to wait, observing everything with the sharp attention the witches had drilled into her. The pack dynamics were easy enough to read, the subtle displays of dominance and submission, the careful hierarchy that kept order among dozens of apex predators forced to live in close proximity. What surprised her was the lack of fear. In her memories, Ironfang wolves were monsters draped in shadow, creatures of pure malice who killed for pleasure. These wolves laughed with their children, shared food with their packmates, touched each other with casual affection. She had expected to find demons. Instead, she found people. The thought was dangerous, and she pushed it aside ruthlessly. Evil often wore pleasant faces. The wolf who had killed her father might have played with his own children just hours before the raid. "You're the healer." The voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the courtyard noise like a blade through silk. Lyra looked up and felt the world tilt sideways. Kael Draven stood before her, and he was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected a monster, scarred and brutal, marked by the violence he had inherited. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who might have been carved from marble by an artist who understood both beauty and sorrow. Dark hair fell across features that were sharp enough to cut, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and deep and utterly unreadable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the predatory grace that marked all alphas. But there was something else, a weight to his stillness, a careful control that spoke of power held in rigid check. He stood like a man who had learned not to trust his own strength. "I am," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "Mira Thornfield." When their eyes met, something happened that the witch's training had never prepared her for. The mate bond struck like lightning. It was immediate, overwhelming, undeniable. Every cell in her body suddenly recognized him as the other half of her soul, the missing piece that would make her complete. The urge to submit, to bare her throat, to claim and be claimed crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her carefully constructed identity shattered like glass. Kael's nostrils flared and she saw his pupils dilate. He felt it too, this impossible, unwanted connection that bound them together across every law of nature and good sense. For a heartbeat, his perfect control slipped, and she caught a glimpse of something wild and hungry in those storm-gray eyes. Then his expression smoothed into polite neutrality, as if the moment had never happened. "You carry medicines," he said, his voice giving nothing away. "Our pack physician will want to examine them." "Of course." She stood, relieved to find her legs steady beneath her. "I'm happy to share whatever knowledge might help." He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. "Eric will see to your needs. You'll be given quarters for the night." He turned to go, then paused. When he looked back at her, there was something in his expression she couldn't read. Calculation, perhaps, or recognition. "Welcome to Ironfang, Mira Thornfield," he said quietly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then he was gone, disappearing into the fortress like smoke, leaving her alone with the terrible knowledge that everything had just become infinitely more complicated. The mate bond hummed between them like a live wire, even across the distance. Her hands trembled as she picked up her healer's satchel, and she had to fight the urge to follow him, to chase after the scent of pine and winter that clung to his skin. She had come here to kill him. Now, staring at the doorway where he had vanished, she wasn't sure she could even breathe without him. Fate, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humor. Lyra's guest chamber was a cage made of luxury. Stone walls hung with rich tapestries, a fire crackling in an ornate hearth, a bed large enough for 3 people draped in furs that probably cost more than most wolves saw in a lifetime. It should have been comfortable. Instead, it felt like a beautiful trap, and she paced its confines like the caged wolf she was. 3 hours had passed since her encounter with Kael in the courtyard. 3 hours of pretending to examine the pack physician's stores, of smiling at servants who brought her food, of acting like a simple healer, grateful for Ironfang hospitality. 3 hours of fighting the mate bond that sang in her blood like poison. She pressed her palms against the cool stone of the window and stared out at the moonlit mountains. The witches had taught her to sever emotional connections, to cut away anything that might compromise her mission. She had practiced the technique hundreds of times on smaller bonds, friendships, attractions, the fleeting connections that formed between people who shared danger or hardship. This was different. This felt woven into her very DNA. "Focus," she told herself, reaching for the mental exercises Morwen had drilled into her. "You are a weapon. Weapons do not feel. Weapons do not want." But her skin still tingled where Kael's gaze had touched her. Her wolf half whined constantly now, a low keen of need that no amount of mental discipline could silence. And underneath it all, worse than the physical attraction, was a growing certainty that she knew him somehow. Not his face or his voice, but something deeper. Something that recognized him as home. A soft knock interrupted her spiral of self-recrimination. "Come in," she called, turning from the window and smoothing her expression into polite neutrality. The door opened to reveal not a servant, but Kael himself. He had changed from his formal alpha attire into simple black clothing that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. Without the ceremonial trappings of leadership, he was just a man, a predator in human form, all lean muscle and controlled power. And he was in her room, alone, at night. "I brought wine," he said, lifting a bottle and 2 glasses as if this were a perfectly normal social call. "I thought you might appreciate something stronger than water after your journey." She should refuse. should maintain the careful distance between healer and alpha, should not do anything that might compromise her cover or give him reason to look too closely at who she really was. Instead, she found herself nodding. That's thoughtful. He moved into the room with that predatory grace, setting the wine on the small table near the fireplace. When he poured, she noticed his hands were perfectly steady, unlike hers, which trembled slightly as she accepted the glass. To successful healing, he said, raising his wine in a toast. To successful healing, she echoed, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. They drank in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Lyra tried to think of something safe to say, some innocuous healer comment that would keep her cover intact. Instead, she found herself studying his face in the flickering light, cataloging the sharp line of his jaw, the way shadows gathered in the hollow of his throat. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly. Her heart skipped. "I'm sorry?" "Most traveling healers are older, more weathered. You look like you've spent your life in libraries, not on the road." It was a gentle probe, delivered with casual curiosity, but Lyra heard the question underneath. "Who are you really?" "I had a good teacher," she said carefully. "She believed in preserving knowledge, not just practicing it." "Ah," he nodded, but his storm-gray eyes remained sharp. "And this teacher, where did she practice?" Another trap, velvet wrap but no less dangerous. Lyra sipped her wine and tried to look thoughtful rather than panicked. The witches had provided her with a complete false history, but under Kael's steady gaze, the lies felt transparent as glass. "The Whitewood Territories," she said finally. "A small settlement near the eastern border. You wouldn't know it. I might surprise you." His voice was soft, almost conversational. "I make it my business to know the healers in neighboring territories, in case my people have need of their services." The wine turned bitter on her tongue. He was testing her, probing for inconsistencies in her story. How much did he suspect? How much did he know? "It was very small," she said, keeping her voice level. "More of a cottage than a settlement, really. My teacher preferred solitude." Kael set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The mate bond hummed between them, a constant low-frequency vibration that made it hard to think clearly. "You're afraid of me," he observed. The statement was so unexpected that she nearly dropped her glass. What?" "Your scent." He gestured vaguely toward her. "Fear has a very distinctive smell. Most healers who come here are nervous, certainly. The Iron Fang reputation precedes us. But you," he tilted his head, considering, "you smell like prey that knows it's being hunted." "Because I am," she thought desperately, "and so are you." "Your pack has a fearsome reputation," she said aloud. "Perhaps I'm simply cautious." Perhaps. But his tone suggested he didn't believe her any more than she believed herself. They sat in silence again, the tension between them thick enough to taste. Lyra found herself cataloging potential weapons, the fireplace poker, a letter opener on the writing desk, the wine glasses themselves if broken properly. But even as she plotted, another part of her mind was focused on entirely different things. The way firelight caught in his dark hair, the unconscious grace with which he moved. The fact that he had come to her room alone, unarmed, as if he trusted her completely, as if he had no idea she had spent 10 years learning to kill him. "The bond," he said suddenly, and her blood went cold. "You feel it too." She opened her mouth to deny it, to pretend she didn't know what he meant, but the words died in her throat when she met his eyes. There was no point in lying. They both knew what had happened in the courtyard. "Yes," she whispered. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. "It's inconvenient." The understatement was so profound that she almost laughed. Inconvenient. The mate bond between a disguised assassin and her target was inconvenient the way a forest fire was warm. "Very," she agreed. "I won't act on it," he said quietly. "Whatever this is between us, I won't force your hand. You have my word." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her. She had expected many things from Kael Draven. Cruelty, suspicion, the casual arrogance of a powerful alpha. She had not expected consideration, respect, the sort of restrained honor that put comfort above his own desires. It would have been easier if he had been a monster. "Thank you," she managed. He stood then, moving toward the door with that same controlled grace. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. Sleep well, Mira Thornfield, he said softly. Tomorrow we hunt a rogue that's been terrorizing the northern settlements. Perhaps you'd like to see how Ironfang deals with real monsters. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the terrible knowledge that she was falling for the man she had come to kill. Some prisons were built from duty, others from desire, but all of them had locks that could only be opened from within. The fortress slept, but Lyra did not. She lay in the two soft beds staring at shadows that danced across the ceiling like accusatory fingers. 3 days had passed since Kael's midnight visit. 3 days of playing healer, of tending minor wounds and mixing harmless tinctures, of pretending the mate bond wasn't slowly driving her insane. 3 days of watching him. He was nothing like the monster from her nightmares. She had seen him settle disputes with quiet wisdom, comfort grieving packmates with genuine compassion, laugh at a child's joke with unguarded joy. Every interaction chipped away at the hatred she had nursed for 10 years, replacing it with something infinitely more dangerous. Understanding, respect, the beginnings of something that might have been love, if she let it grow. She couldn't let it grow. The silver blade was cold against her palm as she slipped from beneath the furs. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting her borrowed nightgown ghostly pale. She had memorized the fortress layout during her stay: servants' passages, guard rotations, the winding path to the Alpha's private chambers. Tonight, she would finish what the witches had started. Tonight, she would honor the vow she had made in blood and ash. The corridors were dark and silent, filled with the deep quiet that came in the hours before dawn. Lyra moved like smoke, her bare feet soundless on cold stone. Past sleeping guards, past chambers where pack members dreamed peacefully behind thick doors. Past the life she might have had if fate had been kinder. Kael's chambers occupied the highest tower, accessible by a spiral staircase that wound upward like a stone serpent. No guards here. Alphas were expected to be dangerous enough to protect themselves. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, as if he had been expecting her. She paused at the threshold, silver blade trembling in her grip. Beyond lay the man who had haunted her dreams for a decade, the son of her family's killer, the other half of her soul. Weapons do not hesitate, Morwen's voice whispered in her memory. Lyra pushed open the door and stepped into darkness. The chamber was larger than her entire guest room, dominated by a massive bed carved from black wood. Moonlight spilled through tall windows, illuminating tapestries that depicted wolves running beneath star-filled skies. It should have felt like a lair. Instead, it felt oddly peaceful. Kael lay sleeping in the center of the great bed, one arm thrown over his eyes as if even in dreams he sought to shield himself from some invisible light. The covers had twisted around his waist, leaving his chest bare. In sleep, the careful control he wore like armor had fallen away, revealing something younger and infinitely more vulnerable. She approached on silent feet, the blade steady in her hand, close enough to smell the pine and winter scent of his skin. Close enough to see the old scars that marked his torso, evidence of battles fought and survived, close enough to kill. She raised the knife, moonlight catching the silver edge. One quick thrust between the ribs, it would be over in seconds. Justice for her family, peace for the broken child who still wept in her dreams. His eyes opened, storm gray and utterly calm, as if waking to find an assassin poised above him was nothing more than mildly interesting. He looked at her face, then at the blade in her hand, then back to her face. "I was wondering when you'd try," he said quietly. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had been so careful, so perfectly disguised. How long had he known? "You're not surprised," she whispered. "Should I be?" He made no move to defend himself, didn't even shift position on the bed. "You've been planning my death since the moment you arrived. I can smell it on you. The intent, the preparation, the guilt." Her hand began to shake. The blade wavered in the moonlight. "Then why didn't you stop me?" Something that might have been sadness flickered across his features. "Because I understand what it means to want someone dead. And because..." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You want to slit my throat, and yet I can smell your desire." The mate bond pulsed between them like a living thing, hot and desperate and impossible to deny. Even now, with murder in her heart and silver in her hand, her body responded to his nearness. Her wolf half whined with need, begging her to drop the blade and claim what was hers. "I hate you," she said, but the words came out broken. "I know." His voice was gentle, understanding. "But you want me anyway, just as I want you, despite knowing what you are." "What I am?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Kael sat up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle her into action. The covers fell away entirely, and she found herself staring at the lean planes of muscle that shifted beneath scarred skin. "Lyra Vale," he said quietly, "last survivor of the Vale Pack, trained by the witch covens in the art of death, come to avenge your family's murder." Her false identity crumbled like sand. There was no point in denial. He had seen through her from the beginning. "How long have you known?" "Since the moment you walked into my courtyard." He shifted slightly, and she tensed, but he only leaned back against the headboard. "You have your mother's eyes, and your father's stubborn chin." The casual mention of her parents nearly broke her. "You knew them?" "I met them once, at a peace summit when I was barely old enough to attend." His expression grew distant with memory. "Your mother was kind to a nervous young heir who spilled wine on his ceremonial robes. Your father helped me clean the stain before anyone else noticed." The knife trembled in her grip. She didn't want to hear this. Didn't want to think of her parents as real people who had touched other lives, who had been more than just victims in her revenge fantasy. "They're dead because of you," she whispered. "They're dead because of my father," Kael corrected quietly, "a man I killed with my own hands 3 years ago." The words hit her like a slap. She stared at him, searching his face for lies and finding none. "What?" "He was a monster," Kael said simply. "Brutal, paranoid, drunk on power. He ordered raids on innocent packs because he enjoyed the fear it inspired. He killed children because they might grow up to challenge him." His jaw tightened. "I endured it as long as I could. But when he started talking about wiping out the eastern settlements for sport—" "You killed your own father." "I executed a tyrant." There was no pride in his voice, no satisfaction, only weary acceptance. It was necessary, it was justice. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. The silver blade fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering on the stone floor. 10 years of hatred, 10 years of training, 10 years of living for revenge, all of it built on a lie. The man she had come to kill had already done what she dreamed of doing. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was lying to save my own skin?" She sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The mattress dipped under her slight frame, and she found herself mere inches from the man she had spent a decade learning to hate, the man who had avenged her family before she'd ever had the chance. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, the words barely audible. Kael's hand moved slowly, carefully, until his fingers barely brushed hers. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm, and she had to fight not to lean into the contact. "You could stay," he said quietly. "Not as an assassin, not as a healer, just stay." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. On one side lay everything she had been, the broken child, the trained killer, the weapon forged in grief and sharpened by rage. On the other side lay possibility. A future she had never dared imagine. A chance to be more than the sum of her pain. But bridges could be burned, and some chasms were too wide to cross. In the space between vengeance and forgiveness, a heart learned that some wounds could only heal in the light. Dawn found them still sitting in the ruins of her mission. Lyra had pulled her knees to her chest, making herself small on the edge of Kael's massive bed. He remained where he was, close enough to touch, but careful not to crowd her. The silver blade lay forgotten on the floor between them, like a discarded promise. "Tell me about that night," she said finally, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. Kael was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one carried weight. "My father called it a cleansing raid, said the Vale Pack was harboring rogues, spreading sedition among the smaller territories." He stared out the window at the lightening sky. "I was 22, old enough to know it was a lie, too young to stop him." You went with them. It wasn't a question. I commanded the reserve force, stayed back while the main raiders. He swallowed hard. I told myself I was being strategic, keeping the escape routes clear. But really, I was a coward who couldn't stomach watching innocents die. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Lyra found herself studying his profile in the growing light, the sharp line of his jaw, the way shadows gathered beneath his eyes. He looked older than his 32 years, marked by the weight of inherited sins. What happened when you returned? My father was drunk on victory and blood. He described every death in loving detail. How your father fought to the end. How your mother tried to shield the children. Kael's hands clenched into fists. He laughed about the little girl they couldn't find, said she probably burned with the rest. Something sharp and hot rose in Lyra's throat. She had spent 10 years imagining that night, but hearing it described by someone who had been there, someone who had watched her family's killer celebrate their deaths, made it real in a way her nightmares never had. I threw up in the stables afterward, Kael continued quietly. Couldn't keep food down for days. My father said it would pass, that squeamishness was a luxury alphas couldn't afford. His voice turned bitter. He was right about that, at least. When did you know that you would kill him? The night I learned you had survived. Lyra's head snapped up. What? Kael met her eyes, and she saw something vulnerable in their gray depths. 3 years ago, a dying witch came to our gates. Old, half-mad, speaking in riddles about death, walking on silent feet. Most of my pack dismissed her as a crone seeking shelter, but she grabbed my hand and spoke your name. The breath left Lyra's lungs in a rush. Vera. You knew her? She trained me. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. Along with 2 others, they found me in the ruins of my home, taught me to kill. They called it justice. Kael nodded slowly. The dying witch, Vera, she told me about a broken child who had been forged into a blade. She said you would come for me when the moon was dark and the time was right. He paused, studying her face. She said you would either be my salvation or my doom. Why didn't you run? Why didn't you have me killed the moment I arrived? Because I deserved whatever you planned to do to me. The words were simple, matter of fact. My father's crimes were mine to bear. His debts were mine to pay. Lyra stared at him, searching for deception and finding only exhausted honesty. You wanted to die. I wanted to matter. He looked down at his hands, strong, capable hands that had ended his own father's life. For 3 years, I've ruled through fear inherited from a monster. The pack obeys me because they're terrified of what I might become. Other territories negotiate with me because they remember what my father was capable of. His laugh was bitter as winter wind. I'm a king of nothing, ruling through a ghost's reputation. The pain in his voice was so raw, it made her chest ache. She had spent 10 years hating him, but she had never considered what it might cost to inherit a legacy of violence. To be judged not for his own actions, but for the sins of the father he had ultimately destroyed. The pack loves you, she said softly. I've watched them. They don't follow you out of fear. They follow the idea of what an alpha should be. Strong, decisive, uncompromising. He met her eyes again. But what happens when they realize I'm just a man trying to build something better on a foundation of bones? Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Outside, the fortress was beginning to wake, the distant sounds of servants starting their daily tasks, guards changing shifts, life continuing in its eternal rhythm. Why are you telling me this? Lyra asked finally. Because you're the only person who has the right to judge me. Kael's voice was quiet, certain. Everyone else sees what they expect to see. The Alpha's son, the inherited leader, the symbol of pack strength. But you see the man who failed to save your family. The coward who let innocents die because he was too weak to stand against his father. You were 22, old enough to choose. The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra found herself remembering her own choices at 22, the decision to accept her final mission, to walk into the fortress of her enemy with murder in her heart. How easily those choices had seemed then. How complicated they felt now. I spent 10 years learning to hate you, she whispered. And now? She looked at him, really looked at him, saw the scars that marked his body like a map of old pain, saw the careful way he held himself, as if expecting a blow that never came, saw the loneliness that surrounded him like armor, keeping the world at arm's length, saw a man who had been shaped by violence but had chosen something different. Now I don't know what I feel, she admitted. Kael nodded as if he had expected that answer. The bond makes it complicated. The bond makes everything complicated. The mate connection hummed between them, a constant low-frequency reminder of what they could be to each other, what they already were, whether they acknowledged it or not. I won't claim you, he said quietly, not while you're still deciding who you want to be, not while you're carrying this much pain. The words should have been a relief. Instead, they felt like loss, the future she hadn't known she wanted, slipping away before she could reach for it. What if I decide I want to leave? Then I'll let you go. His voice was steady, certain, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that the best thing to ever happen to me walked away because I wasn't worth staying for. The honesty in his words was devastating. Lyra felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but shifting, making room for possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. And if I stay? Kael's smile was small, fragile, beautiful as sunrise after the longest night. Then maybe we both get a chance to be something other than what our pain made us. Sometimes the greatest courage was not in striking the killing blow, but in staying your hand and choosing to heal instead. The rogue's scent was 3 days old and reeked of madness. Lyra knelt beside the torn earth where massive claws had gouged furrows deep enough to plant seeds. Around her, the hunting party spread out in a careful grid, Kael's most trusted warriors, reading the story written in blood and broken branches. She shouldn't be here. Healers didn't join hunting parties, didn't track dangerous rogues through territory that grew wilder with each mile from the fortress. But when Kael had asked if she wanted to see how Ironfang dealt with real monsters, something in his gray eyes had made it impossible to refuse. Female, reported Marcus, the lead tracker. Large for her sex. Been alone for at least a season, maybe longer. Kills? Kael's voice was calm, professional, but Lyra caught the tension in the set of his shoulders. 7 that we know of. 3 humans, 4 wolves, all partially consumed. Marcus spat into the dirt. She's not hunting for survival anymore. She's hunting for pleasure. A rogue who killed for sport was the worst kind of threat. A wolf so far gone that pack bonds meant nothing, so lost to madness that only death could stop them. Lyra had seen their work before, in the settlements the witches had passed through. The aftermath was always the same. Torn bodies, terrorized survivors, communities that would never feel safe again. Trail leads north, Marcus continued, pointing toward the dense woods that climbed toward the mountain peaks. Into the Deadlands. Several wolves exchanged uneasy glances. The Deadlands were exactly what they sounded like, territory so harsh and unwelcoming that even desperate rogues usually avoided them. For a mad wolf to retreat there suggested either ultimate cunning or complete loss of self-preservation instincts. 6 hours of daylight left, Kael said, studying the sky. We follow until we find her or the trail goes cold. The hunt began in earnest then. Lyra fell into step beside Eric, the pack's second in command, as they followed the devastation the rogue had left in her wake. Broken trees, scattered bones, the lingering smell of decay that marked a predator who no longer cared about hiding her presence. You move quietly for a healer, Eric observed after they had walked in silence for an hour. Lyra glanced at him, noting the casual way his hand rested near his weapon. I spent time in the wild before finding my calling. You learn to step lightly or become something's dinner. It was close enough to the truth to pass examination. The witches had taught her to move like smoke, to track like a wolf, to kill like shadow given form. But those skills served a healer as well as an assassin. Both professions required patience, observation, the ability to read signs others missed. Good skill to have out here, Eric agreed. These mountains don't forgive carelessness. They pressed deeper into the wilderness, following the rogue's increasingly erratic trail. What had started as purposeful movement toward specific targets began to show signs of confusion. Doubled back paths, random attacks on trees and rocks, the sort of behavior that suggested a mind fracturing under the weight of its own violence. Lyra found herself watching Kael as they tracked. He moved with the same predatory grace she had observed in the fortress, but here in the wild it seemed more natural, less controlled. This was what he had been born for: leading, protecting, making the hard decisions that kept his people safe. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the trees when they found the rogue's lair. It had once been a cave system, carved by underground streams over countless centuries. Now it was a charnel house. Bones littered the entrance, some old enough to be bleached white by weather, others still red with recent blood. The smell that rolled out of the darkness was overwhelming: death and madness and something else, something that made every wolf in the hunting party bare their teeth in instinctive revulsion. "She's in there," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with disgust. "Deep, and she knows we're here." As if summoned by his words, a howl echoed from the cave depths. It was nothing like the songs wolves sang to the moon. This was the sound of something that had forgotten what it meant to be whole, a voice broken by isolation and violence into jagged pieces that cut the air like shattered glass. "Standard formation," Kael ordered quietly. "Marcus and Eric with me. The rest of you stay here and make sure nothing gets past us." "Alpha," one of the younger warriors stepped forward. "Let me go instead. If something happens to you—" "Nothing will happen to me." Kael's voice carried the absolute certainty of an alpha who had never lost a hunt. "But if it does, Eric knows what to do." He started toward the cave mouth, then paused and looked back at Lyra. Something passed between them, not words but understanding. She saw the question in his eyes and found herself nodding before she fully realized what she was agreeing to. "The healer comes with us," Kael said, "in case we need to treat wounds quickly." Eric's eyebrows shot up. "Alpha, with respect, this isn't—" "She comes." The words brooked no argument. "Stay close, watch your footing, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" "Understood," Lyra said, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. The cave swallowed them like a hungry mouth. It was darker than the deepest night, and the stench grew worse with every step. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, creating phantom sounds that made it impossible to tell where real threats might be lurking. Kael moved ahead of them with supernatural confidence, navigating by senses Lyra could only guess at. They found the rogue in a cavern that opened like a cathedral beneath the mountain. She had been beautiful once. Even now, crouched among the bones of her victims with madness burning in her yellow eyes, traces of that beauty remained. But it was a ruined beauty, corrupted by months or years of isolation and violence, until only the hunger remained. When she saw them, she smiled. Her teeth were stained red. "Visitors," she purred, her voice like broken bells. "How lovely. It's been so long since I had proper company." "Alara Nightwind," Kael said quietly. "I remember you. You were mated to Thomas Greystone before the plague took your pack." The rogue's smile widened, becoming something terrible. "Thomas is here with me. We're together again. Would you like to meet him?" She gestured toward a pile of bones in the corner, and Lyra's stomach turned as she realized what they were looking at. The rogue hadn't just killed her mate, she had kept him, carried his remains with her as she descended into madness. "Alara," Kael's voice was gentle, compassionate. "You're sick. Let us help you." "Help?" The rogue threw back her head and laughed, and the sound echoed through the cavern like breaking glass. "I don't need help. I'm perfect now, free. No more pack bonds to chain me, no more duties to constrain me. I take what I want, kill what I please, and no one can stop me." "I can stop you," Kael said simply. The rogue's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Lyra saw calculation behind the madness. "The famous Alpha Draven, come to collect another trophy for your father's legacy?" "My father is dead." "Is he?" Alara's grin turned vicious. "Are you sure? Because you smell like him. You move like him. You hunt like him." She took a step forward, and Lyra saw the muscles bunching beneath her torn clothing. "Tell me, little Alpha, when you kill me, will you enjoy it as much as he enjoyed killing my pack?" The words hit their target. Lyra saw Kael flinch, saw doubt flicker across his features. In that moment of hesitation, the rogue struck. She moved faster than thought, crossing the cavern in a bound that defied human limitations. Her claws caught Kael across the chest, sending him stumbling backward as blood bloomed across his shirt. Eric moved to intervene, but the rogue was already spinning toward him, her teeth bared in a snarl of pure hunger. She would kill the beta, then return to finish Kael while he was wounded and shaken. Lyra didn't think. She simply moved. The throwing knife left her hand with the precision of 10 years' training. It took the rogue in the throat, cutting off her snarl mid-note. Alara stumbled, clawing at the blade, her eyes wide with shock. But it wasn't a killing blow. The rogue pulled out the knife and threw it aside, her supernatural healing already beginning to close the wound. She turned toward Lyra with murder in her yellow eyes. "Now you die, little healer." Keel's roar shook the cavern. He hit the rogue from behind with the full force of an alpha's fury, his claws extended, his humanity stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. They went down in a tangle of limbs and blood and desperate violence. The fight was brief but savage. In the end, Kael stood over the rogue's still form, his chest heaving, his hands stained with blood that wasn't entirely his own. "Is she," Lyra began, "dead?" Kael's voice was flat, emotionless, finally at peace. They stood in the cavern's silence, surrounded by the evidence of madness and death. Eric moved to gather Thomas Greystone's remains for proper burial. Kael stared down at the rogue who had once been a loving mate, a valued pack member, a woman with hopes and dreams and a future. "You saved my life," he said quietly, not looking at Lyra. "You would have done the same for me." "Would I?" He finally met her eyes, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in their gray depths. "When she called me my father's son, I hesitated. For a moment, I wondered if she was right, if I really am just a monster pretending to be something better." Lyra stepped closer, close enough to smell the blood and sweat and fear that clung to his skin. "You're not your father." "How can you be sure? Because when you had the chance to kill me, you chose mercy. When you could have claimed me by force, you chose patience. When you saw a threat to your pack, you chose to face it yourself, rather than send others to die in your place." She reached up and touched his cheek, feeling him lean into the contact despite himself. "Your father would have done none of those things." Kael closed his eyes and let himself be still for a moment, let himself accept the comfort she offered. When he opened them again, some of the haunted look had faded. "We should go," he said. "The others will be worried." They made their way back through the cave system, carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. But as they emerged into the fading daylight, Lyra realized something had changed between them. The careful distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. Trust, understanding, the beginning of something that might, given time and patience, become love. In the darkness beneath the mountain, two wounded souls had found light in each other's courage. The rain came at midnight, turning the fortress windows into rivers of silver. Lyra sat by the fire in her chambers, supposedly reading a treatise on mountain herbs, but her thoughts kept drifting to the cave, to the moment when she had thrown the knife without thinking, when instinct had overridden 10 years of careful planning. She had saved the life of the man she had come to kill, and the realization sat in her chest like a stone. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. She opened the door to find Kael standing in the corridor, his dark hair damp with rain. He had changed from his hunting clothes into simple black, but she could still see the white bandages beneath his shirt where the rogue's claws had found their mark. "You should be resting," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I should be doing many things." He moved to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed mountains. "Sleeping, forgetting what happened today, pretending that I don't know what you did in that cave." Her heart stumbled. "Kael, you threw that knife like someone who had done it 1,000 times before." He turned to face her, and she saw knowledge in his gray eyes. Not suspicion, certainty. No healer moves like that. No innocent woman carries blades with that kind of precision. The carefully constructed lie began to crumble. "I told you I had spent time in the wild. You told me many things." His voice was soft, not accusatory but tired. "Most of them true, I think, but not complete." Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of deception settle around her shoulders like a shroud. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me who you really are. Not the story the witches gave you, not the role you've been playing, you." When she looked at him again, she saw no anger in his expression, no betrayal or hurt or fear. just patient waiting, as if he had all the time in the world for her to find the courage to speak. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. "I've been Lyra, the broken child, and Lyra, the weapon, for so long that I forgot there might be anything else." Kael crossed the room slowly, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The mate bond hummed between them, stronger now than it had ever been. In the cave, when she had acted to save his life, something had shifted. The careful walls she had built around her heart had developed cracks, and now she could feel everything bleeding through: want and need and a desperate longing for something she couldn't name. "You should be afraid of me," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Should I?" He lifted one hand, not quite touching her cheek, but close enough that she could feel the ghost of contact. "You've had a dozen chances to kill me. Instead, you keep saving my life. The witches trained me to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment. Is this it?" His voice was velvet soft, hypnotic. "Your perfect moment?" She stared up at him, memorizing the sharp angles of his face in the firelight. He was close enough to kiss, close enough to kill, close enough to claim. Her wolf half sang with approval, begging her to close the distance between them. "No," she breathed. "This is the moment I choose something different." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was nothing like the gentle, tentative first kiss she had imagined. This was desperate, hungry, 10 years of loneliness and pain, and carefully buried hope pouring out all at once. He tasted like storm in wild places, like promises made in darkness and kept in light. Kael went perfectly still for a heartbeat, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Then his control shattered like glass, and he kissed her back with a ferocity that took her breath away. His hands found her waist, pulling her against him until there was no space left between their bodies. She could feel the rapid beat of his heart, could smell the pine and winter scent that clung to his skin. Every nerve ending came alive under his touch, and she heard herself make a sound that was part sigh, part plea. "Lyra." Her name was a prayer on his lips, reverent and desperate. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, she began working at the fastenings of his shirt. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with anticipation. When she pushed the fabric aside, she found the bandages covering his wounds and something twisted in her chest. "I could have lost you today," she whispered, her fingertips tracing the edge of white cloth. "But you didn't." His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You saved me. Again. I don't want to be a weapon anymore." "Then don't be." His forehead rested against hers, and she felt the careful control he wore like armor beginning to slip. "Be whatever you want to be. Stay, leave, hate me, love me. Just be real. Be you." The freedom in his words was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. For 10 years, she had been shaped by other people's expectations: the witch's need for vengeance, her own hunger for justice, the broken child's desperate desire to make the pain stop. But here, in the circle of Kael's arms, she could be something else entirely. She could be a woman who chose her own path. Her hands found the hem of her nightgown, and she pulled it over her head in one fluid motion. Kael's breath caught, his eyes darkening as they traced the pale curves of her body in the firelight. She had scars too, thin lines from training accidents, a burn on her shoulder from learning to work with silver, the faint marks left by claws and teeth during the more brutal lessons. "Beautiful," he murmured, and she heard truth in his voice, not flattery. When he touched her, it was with the reverence of a man handling something precious and fragile. His palms skimmed her sides, her shoulders, the hollow of her throat, where her pulse hammered like a caged bird. Every caress sent fire racing along her nerves, and she found herself arching into his touch, seeking more. They moved together toward the bed, shedding the last barriers between them with desperate urgency. When skin met skin, when they finally came together in the dance as old as moonlight, Lyra felt something inside her chest crack open and bloom. This wasn't the calculated seduction the witches had trained her for. This wasn't manipulation or strategy or another weapon in her arsenal. This was raw, honest, beautiful. Two people finding solace in each other's arms, healing old wounds with new warmth. Kael worshipped her body with hands and mouth and whispered endearments, as if he could make up for 10 years of loneliness in a single night. She gave herself to the sensations, to the overwhelming rightness of being held and wanted and cherished. When release finally claimed them both, it was with the force of a dam breaking. She cried out his name like a benediction, and he buried his face in her throat as if he could somehow crawl inside her skin and stay there forever. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, listening to the gradual slowing of his heartbeat. Rain continued to patter against the windows, but the storm outside seemed distant and unimportant compared to the warmth they had created between them. "I should go," Kael said quietly, but made no move to leave. "Should you?" She traced lazy patterns on his skin, marveling at the way he shivered under her touch. "I don't want to complicate things for you. If the pack sees me leaving your chambers at dawn, let them see." The words surprised her with their vehemence. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be something I'm not." Keel's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. What happens now? It was the question she had been avoiding, the future that stretched out before them like uncharted territory. The witches would expect her to complete her mission. The mate bond would demand acknowledgement. The pack would have opinions about their alpha, taking a mysterious healer to his bed. But in this moment, wrapped in warmth and possibility, those concerns felt distant and manageable. "Now we see what we're building," she said softly, "one day at a time." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning illuminated the fortress walls. But inside, two souls who had spent years lost in darkness had finally found their way to something that might, with patience and courage, become light. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, an assassin learned what it meant to be cherished, and an alpha discovered that the greatest strength was sometimes found in surrender. The Raven arrived 3 weeks after Lyra had stopped being a weapon. She was in the fortress gardens, gathering herbs for the pack physician, when the blackbird settled on the stone wall beside her basket. A silver ring gleamed around its leg, the witch's mark. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. With trembling fingers, she untied the message scroll. The words were written in Morwen's spidery script, each letter sharp as a blade. "The moon has turned full twice since your arrival. Your silence speaks of failure or betrayal. Complete the task before the next new moon, or face the consequences of broken vows." The girl remembers what the woman has forgotten. Lyra crumpled the parchment in her fist, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 days. They were giving her 6 days to kill Kael, or face whatever punishment the witches deemed fitting for a failed assassin. The raven cocked its head, studying her with one bright black eye, waiting for a response that would never come. "Fly home," she whispered, then louder. "Tell them the girl is dead." The bird launched itself skyward with a harsh cry, disappearing into the gray afternoon clouds. But Lyra knew that wouldn't be the end of it. The witches didn't accept defiance lightly, and they had invested too much in her training to simply let her walk away. They would come for her. And when they did, they would use every secret, every weakness, every carefully planted fear to drag her back into the darkness she had spent 3 weeks learning to leave behind. "Lyra?" She spun around to find Kael approaching through the garden paths, concern etched across his features. In the weeks since their first night together, he had learned to read her moods with uncanny accuracy. The careful mask she wore for the rest of the pack never fooled him. "What's wrong?" He stopped beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to overwhelm. Even now, even after countless shared intimacies, he was careful with her boundaries. She looked up at him, this man who had become her anchor, her reason for choosing light over darkness, and felt her heart break a little. How could she tell him that their stolen happiness had an expiration date, that the past she had tried to escape was coming for them both? "Nothing," she lied, "just tired." Kael's gray eyes searched her face, and she saw the moment he decided not to press. He trusted her to tell him what he needed to know when she was ready. It was one of the things she loved most about him, and one of the things that made this betrayal cut so deep. "Eric wants to speak with you," he said instead. Something about the pack's winter stores. Your knowledge of medicinal herbs has impressed him. Under other circumstances, the acceptance she had found among Kael's people would have been a gift beyond measure. They had welcomed her into their community, valued her skills, treated her as one of their own. She had begun to think of the fortress as home, of these wolves as family. Now it all felt like glass, beautiful but fragile, destined to shatter at the first wrong touch. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll find him after I finish here." Kael studied her for a moment longer, then leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'll see you at dinner." She watched him walk away, memorizing the confident set of his shoulders, the predatory grace that marked him as Alpha. In 6 days, if she did nothing, the witches would come for her. They would threaten the pack, hurt innocent people, force her hand in ways that would destroy everything she had come to cherish, unless she gave them what they wanted first. The thought made her sick, but she couldn't dismiss it entirely. One life to save many. One moment of decisive action to preserve the peace they had all fought so hard to build. No, the refusal came from somewhere deep and certain, a part of her that had been born in Kael's arms and strengthened by his trust. She would not become a weapon again. She would not sacrifice the man she loved to appease the ghosts of her past. But that left her with very few options, and none of them ended well. Evening found her pacing the battlements like a caged wolf, her mind spinning through possibilities and finding dead ends at every turn. The fortress spread out below her, warm lights spilling from windows, the sounds of pack life drifting up from the courtyards. Children's laughter, adult conversation, the occasional howl of greeting as hunting parties returned home. All of it would be at risk if the witches decided to make an example of her. "You're wearing a path in the stone." Marcus materialized from the shadows with the silent grace that made him the pack's best tracker. He was younger than Kael by several years, but something in his pale eyes suggested he had seen more violence than most wolves twice his age. "Couldn't sleep," Lyra said, not slowing her pace. "Nightmares?" She almost laughed at the bitter irony. Her nightmares weren't about the past anymore. They were about the future, about watching Kael die by her hand or the witches, about seeing the pack torn apart by forces they couldn't understand or fight. Something like that. Marcus fell into step beside her, his presence oddly comforting. Of all Kael's inner circle, he was the one who asked the fewest questions, who seemed to understand that some wounds needed time to heal in darkness before they could bear light. "The Alpha is worried about you," he said quietly. "He shouldn't be, but he is." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her. "Which means the pack is worried, which means I'm asking, is there something we should know? Something we can help with?" The offer of support was genuine. She could hear it in his voice. These wolves would stand with her against whatever threatened their peace. They would fight and die for her if necessary, simply because she mattered to their Alpha. The loyalty was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. "No," she said softly. "Nothing you can help with." Marcus nodded, accepting her words even though they both knew she was lying. "The offer stands. Whatever comes, you don't face it alone. The pack protects its own." The pack protects its own. The words echoed in her mind long after Marcus had disappeared back into the shadows. She wasn't truly pack. Not yet, maybe not ever. But Kael's people had claimed her anyway, offered her the protection of their community simply because she mattered to him. And now her past was going to destroy them all. She found Kael in his study, working late over territorial maps and supply reports. The lamplight caught the silver threads beginning to show in his dark hair, marks of the stress that came with leadership, with carrying the weight of so many lives on his shoulders. He looked up when she entered, and his face brightened with the smile he saved just for her. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to sleep in the gardens." "Just thinking." She settled into the chair across from his desk, studying the maps spread before him. Territory boundaries, trade routes, alliance markers. The careful architecture of peace that he had built in place of his father's legacy of fear. About what? The question she had been dreading. How did you tell someone you loved that you might have to destroy everything they had worked to build? How did you explain that the past had claws long enough to reach into any future you tried to create? Us, she said finally. What we're building here. Kael set down his pen and gave her his full attention. Having doubts, having fears. The admission cost her, but she owed him honesty. I'm not the woman you think I am, Kael. I'm not the healer who wandered into your fortress seeking shelter. I'm something darker, more dangerous. And that darkness, she swallowed hard, it's not done with me yet. I know who you are, he said quietly. I've known from the beginning. Lyra Vale, last daughter of a murdered pack, trained by witches in the arts of death and vengeance, come to kill the son of the man who destroyed her family. The casual recitation of her secrets hit like a physical blow. You knew? I suspected. Then I was certain. Then it stopped mattering. He rose from behind the desk and came around to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. You think your past defines you. It doesn't. You think the darkness you carry makes you unworthy of love. It doesn't. The witches can go to hell. The vehemence in his voice surprised her. You are not their weapon anymore. You are not defined by their hatred or their hunger for revenge. You are mine, and I am yours, and that is worth fighting for. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could overcome the careful cruelty of 3 centuries-old witches who had never learned to forgive. But the raven's message burned in her memory, and she knew that wanting something didn't make it possible. What if they come for me, she whispered. Then we face them together. Kael's hands tightened on hers, and she felt the steady strength that had made him Alpha, that had held his pack together through the chaos of succession. You are not alone anymore, Lyra. Whatever comes, we face it as one. In the darkness of approaching storm, 2 hearts beat in defiant rhythm, refusing to surrender the light they had found in each other. The full moon hung over the fortress like a silver coin, ancient and patient and heavy with power. Lyra stood on the balcony outside Kael's chambers, letting the lunar light wash over her skin. 3 days had passed since the raven's warning. 3 days of stolen moments and careful normalcy while the countdown to her reckoning ticked away like a bomb in her chest. Tomorrow night, the witches would come for their answer. You're thinking too loudly. Kael's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and dark with concern. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to see the love in his eyes when she was so close to losing everything they had built together. The moon is beautiful tonight, she said instead. Is it? He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I was too busy watching you to notice. Despite everything, she found herself smiling. Flatterer, truth-teller. His fingers brushed hers where they rested on the stone railing. You've been distant these past few days. The pack has noticed. Of course they had. Wolves were creatures of instinct and observation, attuned to the subtle shifts in pack dynamics that could mean the difference between harmony and chaos. Her growing anxiety would be as obvious to them as blood in the water. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I don't mean to worry them. They're not worried about pack stability. Kael's hand covered hers completely, warm and steady and impossibly gentle. They're worried about you, about us. The simple statement made her throat tight. She had spent so many years as a weapon, as a tool shaped by other people's hatred, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be valued for her own sake. The pack's concern wasn't political, it was personal, born from genuine affection for the woman they had welcomed into their family. Kael, she began, then stopped. How did you tell someone you loved that you might destroy them? How did you explain that the greatest gift you could give them might be your absence? The bond, he said quietly, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. You feel it pulling stronger tonight. She did. The mate bond thrummed between them like a live wire, amplified by the full moon's power until it was almost impossible to ignore. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to claim him completely, to let him mark her as his own, to bind their souls together so tightly that nothing could ever tear them apart. It was the one thing she couldn't allow herself to want. Yes, she whispered, I feel it too. His voice was rough with restraint, with the effort of holding back desires that grew stronger with every passing hour. It's taking everything I have not to claim you right here under the moonlight. The words sent heat racing through her veins, but underneath the desire was a deeper ache. He was offering her everything, his love, his protection, his very soul, and she was going to have to walk away from it all. Why don't you? The question escaped before she could stop it. Kael was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful thought. Because when I mark you, it should be a choice made in joy, not desperation. Because claiming you under these circumstances, when you're frightened and uncertain, would be taking advantage of something sacred. He turned to face her fully, and she saw moonlight caught in his storm-gray eyes. I want all of you, Lyra. Your trust, your hope, your future, not just your surrender. The words broke something inside her chest. This man, this alpha who could command absolute obedience with a word, who could take whatever he wanted by right of strength and position, was waiting for her permission, waiting for her to feel safe enough, certain enough, whole enough to choose him freely. And she couldn't give him that choice because making it would doom them both. What if I can't? She whispered. What if I'm too broken to ever be what you need? Then we'll figure it out together. His hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. I'm not going anywhere, Lyra. Whatever darkness you're carrying, whatever fears are keeping you awake at night, we face them together. Even if it destroys everything, even then, his certainty was absolute, unshakable, because losing you would destroy me anyway. The love in his voice was overwhelming, devastating in its completeness. She had spent 10 years learning to kill without mercy, to manipulate without conscience, to survive without hope. But she had never learned to accept love without fear, to trust that someone could see all of her, the broken child, the trained weapon, the woman struggling to be something better, and choose to stay anyway. Kael. He kissed her then, cutting off whatever protest she had been about to make. It was desperate and tender and tinged with the wild hunger that came with the full moon's power. She melted into him, letting herself forget for a moment that tomorrow might bring endings, that the future they were building might crumble under the weight of her past. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own desire reflected in his eyes. The mate bond sang between them, demanding completion, demanding the claiming that would make them truly one. Mark me, she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep and desperate. Please, whatever comes tomorrow, I want to belong to you tonight. Kael's eyes flashed with primal hunger, but he didn't move. Lyra, I know what I'm asking. She pressed closer, letting him feel the certainty in her body, the need that had nothing to do with lunar influence and everything to do with love. I know the risks. I choose you anyway. For a heartbeat, she thought he would refuse, thought his careful control and protective instincts would override the desperate want she could smell on his skin. Then his restraint shattered like glass, and he lifted her against him with effortless strength. They barely made it to the bed before need consumed them both. Clothes disappeared under desperate hands, and then there was nothing between them but moonlight and desire and the terrible sweetness of finally giving in. Kael worshipped her body with hands and mouth and whispered promises, as if he could somehow love away every hurt she had ever carried. She gave herself to the sensations, to the overwhelming rightness of being held and wanted and cherished. But when the moment came, when his teeth were at her throat and the bond pulled tight as a bowstring between them, he stopped. Lyra. Her name was a prayer and a question. I need to know you're sure. Once I mark you, there's no going back. You'll be mine, and I'll be yours, and nothing will ever be able to change that. She looked up at him, memorizing the sharp angles of his face in the moonlight, the way love and desire and careful restraint warred in his storm-gray eyes. This man who had every reason to hate her, who had instead chosen to heal her. This alpha who could have claimed her by force, but had waited for her permission, her choice, her trust. I see the fear in your eyes, he said softly. Whatever you're running from, whatever you think is coming for us, we can face it together. But not if you're terrified of being bound to me. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. She was terrified, not of him, never of him, but of what her love might cost him. Of the witches who would see their bond as weakness to exploit, of the possibility that her happiness might be built on his eventual destruction. I'm not afraid of belonging to you, she whispered. I'm afraid of what it might do to you. Understanding flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by determination. Let me worry about that. Let me protect what's mine. And if you can't, then we burn together. His voice was fierce, absolute. But we don't burn alone. She stared up at him, seeing her own desperate love reflected in his eyes, and made her choice. Not the safe choice, not the smart choice, but the only choice her heart would allow. Mark me, she breathed. Make me yours. This time he didn't hesitate. His teeth found the juncture of her neck and shoulder, and when they pierced her skin, the world exploded into sensation and light, and the overwhelming certainty of finally being complete. The mate bond snapped into place with the force of lightning, binding them soul to soul in ways that transcended the merely physical. She felt his love pour into her like liquid fire, felt his strength become hers, and her darkness become shared rather than solitary. She was his, he was hers. And whatever came tomorrow, they would face it as one. But even as she surrendered to the euphoria of completion, even as she felt the marking take hold and seal their fate, a part of her whispered that some bonds were forged in joy and others in sorrow. Under the watching moon, two souls became one, and in that joining planted the seeds of either salvation or destruction. The witches came with the dying light. Lyra felt them before she saw them, a cold presence at the edge of her consciousness, like ice forming on summer water. The mate bond thrummed with Kael's distant contentment as he concluded the day's pack business, unaware that death walked toward his fortress on silent feet. She stood at the window of what had become their shared chambers, watching shadows gather in the valley below. Three figures in tattered black robes, moving with the inexorable patience of carrion birds. They had come to collect their wayward weapon, and they would not be denied. You feel them too. The voice came from the doorway, not Kael, but Eric. The beta's pale eyes were sharp with concern as he stepped into the room, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. I don't know what you mean, Lyra said, but the lie tasted like ash on her tongue. The corruption approaching our territory. Eric moved to stand beside her at the window, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. Ancient malice, old magic turned rancid with hate. There was no point in denying what he could sense as clearly as she could. How long have you known that you were more than you appeared since the first night? Eric's voice was matter-of-fact, free of accusation. That your past was coming for you since 3 days ago when you started moving like prey that smells the hunter. The calm acceptance in his tone was somehow worse than anger would have been. You should have told Kael. Should I? Eric glanced at her, and she saw something that might have been sympathy in his expression. He knows what he needs to know, that you love him, that you would die to protect him, that whatever brought you here originally, it's not what keeps you here now. It might not matter. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the shadows creep closer to the fortress walls. They won't let me simply walk away. Then we make them. The quiet certainty in Eric's voice made her look at him more closely. You are pack now, Lyra, marked and mated and ours to protect. Anyone who threatens you threatens all of us. The loyalty was staggering, humbling, terrifying. These wolves barely knew her, but they were prepared to stand against creatures who had walked the earth for centuries, who had power that mortal minds could barely comprehend. You don't understand what they are, she whispered, what they're capable of. I understand that they made the mistake of threatening something the Alpha loves. Eric's smile was sharp as winter wind, and that is a mistake very few people survive. Before Lyra could respond, the fortress bells began to toll, not the gentle chimes that marked the hours, but the harsh bronze clangor of alarm. Shouts echoed from the courtyards below as guards rushed to their positions. What? She began, then stopped as she saw what had triggered the alert. Fire bloomed at the main gates. Not the natural orange and red of burning wood, but the sickly green flames that spoke of magic twisted into malice. The witches had announced their arrival, and they had not come in peace. Eric, Kael's voice carried clearly across the fortress, sharp with command. Gather the guard, full defensive positions. The beta was already moving, his hand on the door handle. Stay here, he told Lyra. Whatever happens, don't. No. The word came out harder than she intended. This is my fault, my responsibility. I won't hide while others fight my battles. Eric studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then we fight together. They ran through corridors suddenly alive with organized chaos. Pack members moved with practiced efficiency, warriors to their posts, non-combatants to secure areas, children shepherded to the deep vaults where ancient stone would protect them from whatever magic the witches might unleash. Lyra felt the mate bond pull taut as they approached the main courtyard, felt Keel's mixture of fury and fear as he realized she was moving toward danger rather than away from it. But there was no time for argument, no space for the luxury of protection. The courtyard was a scene from nightmare. The green flames had spread from the gates to the surrounding walls, casting everything in an eerie, shifting light. And in the center of it all, untouched by fire or weapon, stood the three witches who had shaped Lyra's life for a decade. Morwen looked exactly as Lyra remembered, ancient and terrible, with eyes like chips of obsidian and power that made the air itself recoil. Nyx crouched beside her like a hunting cat, her curved blades already drawn and gleaming. And Vera was smiling. "Little lamb," the beautiful witch called, her voice carrying clearly over the sounds of alarm and preparation. "You've been very naughty, running away from your lessons, forgetting your promises. We've come to take you home." Kael stood in the center of his defensive formation, his pack arrayed around him like an extension of his will. Even outnumbered and facing magic they didn't understand, they held their ground with the stubborn courage that had made wolves apex predators. "You are not welcome here," Kael said, his voice carrying the full weight of alpha authority. "Leave, and no harm will come to you." Morwen's laugh was like breaking glass. "Harm? To us? Child, we were walking these mountains when your grandfather's grandfather was still suckling at his mother's teat. We have forgotten more about pain than you will ever learn." "Maybe." Kael's hand rested on his sword hilt, but he hadn't drawn the blade yet. "But you're still outnumbered 20-1. Are you certain your magic is worth that much?" "Our magic?" Vera stepped forward, her perfect features alight with malicious glee. "Oh, sweet boy, we don't need magic to destroy you. We have something much better." She gestured toward the fortress walls, and Lyra's blood turned to ice as she saw what the witch was indicating. Marcus stood on the ramparts above them, his bow drawn and an arrow nocked, but he wasn't aiming at the witches. He was aiming at Kael. "You see," Vera continued conversationally, "dear Marcus has been having the most interesting dreams lately, dreams where he remembers his true loyalties, where he recalls that some debts are older than pack bonds." Understanding hit Lyra like a physical blow. Marcus, trusted Marcus, loyal Marcus, was one of theirs. Had always been one of theirs, a sleeper agent planted years ago, waiting for the moment when he would be needed. Marcus. Kael's voice was steady, but Lyra could feel his shock and betrayal through the mate bond. "Stand down. I'm sorry, Alpha." Marcus's voice carried clearly from above, genuinely regretful. "But some orders supersede yours." The arrow flew with perfect accuracy, aimed for the gap in Kael's armor where it would punch through his heart and end his life in seconds. Lyra moved without conscious thought, throwing herself forward, knowing she would never be fast enough, knowing she was about to watch the man she loved die. The arrowhead took her in the shoulder instead of him in the chest. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her body as silver burned her supernatural flesh. But she was alive, and more importantly, so was Kael. The arrow had been meant for him, carved with runes designed to kill an alpha, poisoned with substances that would ensure even a non-fatal wound proved mortal. For her, it was agony, but not death. For him, it would have been over in heartbeats. "Lyra." Kael's roar shook the courtyard as he dropped to his knees beside her. "Get the physician now." Touching. Morwen's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "But ultimately pointless. She belongs to us, boy. Has always belonged to us. And if she won't come willingly..." The witch raised her hands, and power gathered around her like storm clouds. Not the clean energy of nature magic, but something darker, the kind of force that came from centuries of pain and hatred distilled into pure malice. Lyra felt it building, felt the spell that would tear her away from everything she had come to love, and tried to find the strength to fight. but the silver burned in her shoulder, weakening her, making it impossible to focus on anything but the fire spreading through her veins. "Please," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to the witches or to whatever gods might be listening. "Don't hurt them. They're innocent." "Innocent?" Vera laughed, the sound bright and terrible. "Oh, my dear child, no one is innocent, and everyone pays for their choices eventually." The spell struck like lightning, wrapping around Lyra's consciousness like chains. She felt herself being pulled away from her body, from the mate bond, from everything that made her who she had chosen to become. But just before the darkness claimed her, just before the witches could complete their theft, something unexpected happened. Power answered power. It rose from somewhere deep within her, somewhere she had never known existed. Not the trained abilities the witches had given her, but something older, wilder, infinitely more dangerous. Something that had been sleeping in her blood for 21 years, waiting for the moment when she needed it most. The spell shattered like glass against stone. Morwen stumbled backward, shock replacing calculation on her ancient features. And Lyra felt herself change. Not the familiar shift from human to wolf that all her kind could manage, but something else entirely. Something the witches had never planned for. In the moment between heartbeat and breath, a dormant bloodline awakened, and the hunted became the hunter. Lyra woke to the smell of herbs and the sound of quiet breathing. Pain throbbed through her shoulder where the silver arrow had torn through flesh and muscle, but underneath the physical discomfort was something else, a strange hollowness, as if some essential part of her had been carved away while she slept. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the world spun sideways. Easy. Kael's voice, rough with exhaustion and worry. His hands were gentle as they guided her back against the pillows. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days." She blinked up at him, taking in the dark circles under his storm-gray eyes, the stubble that spoke of sleepless nights spent at her bedside. Through the mate bond, she could feel his relief flooding warm and desperate through her consciousness. "The witches," she whispered, and saw his expression tighten. Gone. The single word carried a weight of meaning she wasn't sure she wanted to unpack. Along with Marcus, memory came flooding back, the attack, the betrayal, the moment when something ancient and powerful had risen from her blood like wildfire. She remembered Morwen's shocked face, remembered power that had felt both foreign and familiar coursing through her veins. "What happened to me?" she asked quietly. Kael was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing careful patterns on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of revelations that had shaken him to his core. "We brought in scholars after you collapsed, experts in bloodlines and ancient magic." He met her eyes, and she saw something that might have been awe in their gray depths. "Lyra, your grandmother wasn't just pack nobility. She was a moon daughter." The words hit her like a physical blow. Moon daughters were legend, the offspring of wolves who had mated with lunar spirits in the early days of the world. Their bloodlines carried power that transcended the merely physical, abilities that could reshape reality itself when properly awakened. They were also supposed to be extinct. "That's impossible," she breathed. "Is it?" Kael's smile was wry, exhausted. "The power that shattered Morwen's spell, that wasn't witch magic or wolf strength. That was something older, purer, something that responded to your need to protect what you love." She stared at him, trying to process the implications. If he was right, if she truly carried Moon Daughter blood, then everything the witches had taught her about her limitations was a lie. They had trained her to be a weapon, but they had never known what kind of weapon they were shaping. "The hollowness," she said suddenly. "I can feel something missing." Kael's expression grew pained. "The power you used, it burned away the conditioning the witches had placed on you. The mental barriers, the emotional controls, the ways they had shaped your mind to serve their purpose." He paused, studying her face. "You're free of their influence now, Lyra. Completely free. But freedom has a cost." She understood then why he looked so haunted. The power that had saved them had also destroyed the last threads that connected her to the only family she had known for 10 years. The witches could no longer control her. could no longer reach into her mind and twist her thoughts to their will, but they could still hurt her, and they would never stop trying. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "Yes." Kael's honesty was both brutal and comforting, probably with allies this time, ancient creatures who won't be caught off guard by your awakened abilities. "Then I should leave." The words tasted like poison, but she forced them out anyway. "Before they bring war to your doorstep." No. The refusal was immediate, absolute. "You're not running anymore, Lyra. You're not facing this alone." "Kael, listen to me." He leaned forward, his eyes intense with the force of his conviction. "3 days ago, I watched you take an arrow meant for me. I felt you almost die in my arms. And in that moment, I realized something." He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the fortress courtyards. Below, she could see pack members going about their daily tasks, training, working, living their lives in the peace he had built for them. "I've spent 3 years trying to be worthy of the power I inherited," he said quietly, "trying to prove that I was different from my father, that I could lead through something other than fear. But I was still afraid, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of failing the people who depended on me." "You're not afraid anymore?" "I'm terrified." He turned back to her, and she saw raw honesty in his expression. "But not of making the wrong choice. I'm afraid of losing you, of letting fear keep me from fighting for what matters most." The words hung between them, heavy with promise and determination. Through the mate bond, she could feel the absolute certainty of his resolve. No doubt, no hesitation, just the kind of unwavering commitment that had made him Alpha. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if the witches want you, they'll have to go through me, through all of us." His voice grew stronger, carrying the authority that could command mountains to move. "You are my mate, my equal, my partner in all things, and I will burn the world before I let anyone take you from me." The declaration was everything she had ever wanted to hear, and everything she had never dared hope for. But underneath the fierce joy was a deeper fear, not for herself, but for him. "You don't know what you're choosing," she whispered. "The kind of enemies this will make. The danger." "I know exactly what I'm choosing." Kael returned to her side, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing to believe that love is stronger than hate, that light can overcome darkness, that the future we build together is worth any price we have to pay." Tears she hadn't realized she was crying spilled down her cheeks. For 10 years she had been shaped by other people's hatred, defined by their hunger for revenge. But here was a man offering her something different, not just protection, but partnership. Not just love, but choice. "The pack stands with us." His thumb brushed away her tears with infinite tenderness. "To the last wolf, to the final breath. You saved my life, Lyra. More than that, you saved my soul. Do you think any of them will forget that?" She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the bonds they had all forged were strong enough to withstand whatever storm was coming. But the witches had centuries of experience in breaking things that seemed unbreakable. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she asked quietly. "What if the power I awakened isn't enough to protect everyone I love?" "Then we get stronger." Kael's smile was fierce, beautiful, absolutely certain. "Together, because that's what mates do. They make each other better than they ever could have been alone." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made her breath catch. A collar of white gold and moonstone, delicate as spiderwebs but strong as steel. Not a symbol of ownership, but of partnership, the kind of bond gift that alphas gave to their equals. "Lyra Vale," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and promise. "Last daughter of the Vale Pack, survivor of darkness, bringer of light. Will you stand with me? Will you be my partner in all things, my equal in all decisions, my strength when I falter and my wisdom when I stumble?" The offer was staggering. Not just marriage, but true partnership, the kind of bond that made two people into something greater than the sum of their parts. "Even knowing what it costs," she whispered, "especially knowing what it costs." His eyes held hers, storm gray and absolutely steady. "Because you're worth any price, Lyra. You're worth everything." She looked at him, this man who had seen her at her worst and chosen to love her anyway, who had faced down ancient evil to protect her, who was offering her not just his heart, but his entire future. And she made her choice. Yes, she breathed, to all of it, forever. The collar settled around her throat like a promise kept, like a vow made sacred by witness and will. Through the mate bond, she felt his love pour into her like liquid light, chasing away the last shadows of doubt and fear. They were bound now, not just by the marking he had given her, but by choice freely made and freely accepted. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Under the watching stars, two souls completed their joining, and in that moment of perfect unity, the future shifted toward possibility. They came at dawn, when the fortress was painted gold with morning light. Lyra felt them approaching long before the scouts sounded the alarm, a wrongness in the air that made her newly awakened power recoil like a wounded animal. Not just the three witches this time, but allies drawn from the deep places of the world, creatures that had crawled out of nightmare to answer Morwen's call for vengeance. 50 of them. Marcus reported from his position on the eastern watchtower, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The witches, plus shadow wolves and what looks like a blood mage. The former beta had returned 2 days after the first attack, his face marked with shame and silver scars that spoke of punishment for his failure. Kael had accepted him back without question, without recrimination, the kind of forgiveness that made loyalty burn fiercer than hatred ever could. Defensive positions, Kael commanded, his voice steady despite the odds they faced. Protect the young and the weak. Hold the walls. Trust in each other. Lyra stood beside him on the battlements, the moonstone collar at her throat catching the light like captured starfire. She could feel the weight of expectation from the pack arrayed around them. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of tension that came before a storm no one was certain they could weather. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her words meant for Kael alone. "It's not too late to let me go to them, to save your people." "My people include you." His hand found hers, strong and warm and absolutely steady. "We've had this conversation, love. The answer hasn't changed." Through the mate bond, she felt his certainty, not just in his choice, but in her. He believed, with the kind of faith that moved mountains, that she was strong enough for what was coming, that they were strong enough together. She hoped he was right. The attack began with Morwen's voice, amplified by magic until it echoed from every stone of the fortress. "Last chance, little lamb. Come willingly, and your new pets live. Force us to take you, and we paint these walls with their blood." Kael's response was to draw his sword, the steel ringing clear as a bell in the morning air. Around them, his pack followed suit. Not just warriors, but cooks and healers and merchants who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, even unto death. "Come and take her," Kael called back, his voice carrying the full weight of alpha authority. "We'll be waiting." Morwen's laughter was like breaking glass, sharp enough to cut. So be it. The shadow wolves came first, creatures that had never been fully alive, puppets made of darkness and malice given just enough substance to kill. They flowed over the walls like living smoke, their forms shifting and writhing as they sought flesh to rend. The pack met them with steel and claw, and the kind of courage that came from defending home. But for every shadow wolf they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place, and behind them came worse things. Blood-drunk berserkers whose wounds closed as fast as they were made, wraiths that passed through armor like it was mist. "The witches," Eric shouted over the sounds of battle. "We have to stop the witches, or this won't end." He was right. The creatures were just a distraction, a way to wear down the defenders, while the real threat remained protected in the rear. But reaching Morwen and her sisters meant cutting through an army of nightmares, and Lyra could see that the pack, brave as they were, wouldn't last long enough. "I'm going after them," she said, turning to Kael. "Not alone." His gray eyes were fierce, determined. "We go together, or we don't go at all." "Kael, together." The word brooked no argument. "That was the promise we made. No more fighting alone." She looked at him, this man who had chosen to stand with her against impossible odds, who was prepared to die beside her rather than let her face the darkness alone, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the painful awakening of her power, but something simpler and more profound. Acceptance. Of his love. Of her own worth. of the future they were fighting to build. Together, she agreed, they moved through the battle like dancers in perfect synchronization, Kael's sword clearing a path while Lyra's awakened power turned aside spells and scattered shadow wolves like smoke before wind. The pack closed ranks behind them, holding the line while their alpha and his mate carved through the enemy forces with deadly precision. But it wasn't enough. For every yard they gained, they paid in blood and exhaustion. The witches remained safely behind their wall of summoned horrors, protected and patient as they waited for the defenders to exhaust themselves. That's when Vera made her mistake. The beautiful witch grew impatient with the slow slaughter, stepping forward to hurl a bolt of crackling energy that should have reduced Kael to ash and bone. But she had forgotten, in her arrogance, that Lyra was no longer the broken weapon they had shaped. The spell struck the barrier of moonlight that surrounded them and shattered like glass against granite. Vera stumbled backward, her perfect features twisted with shock and rage. "Impossible," she snarled. "You're ours. You've always been ours." "I was never yours." Lyra's voice power now, the kind of authority that came from claiming her birthright. "I was lost. I was broken. But I was never owned." She stepped forward and silver fire began to gather around her hands. Not the corrupt energy the witches wielded, but something pure and clean and infinitely more dangerous. Moon Daughter power, awakened at last and hungry for justice. "You took a frightened child and tried to make her into a weapon," Lyra continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You fed on her pain, shaped her hatred, used her love for the dead to fuel your own hunger for revenge. But you forgot something important." The fire in her hands grew brighter, and she saw fear flicker across Morwen's ancient features. Children grow up. The power struck all three witches simultaneously. Not the brutal, destructive force they expected, but something else entirely. Light that burned away lies and illusions, that stripped away the carefully constructed facades to reveal the truth beneath. They had been beautiful once, these women, young and hopeful and full of dreams that didn't involve pain and hatred. But centuries of nursing old wounds had twisted them into something monstrous, had turned their gifts into curses and their wisdom into malice. Lyra could have destroyed them, should have, perhaps, given the threat they represented. But as she looked at them, really looked at them, seeing past the evil they had become to the women they had once been, she made a different choice. "You're tired," she said quietly, her voice gentle with compassion they didn't deserve. "So tired of carrying all that hate, all that pain. Let it go. Please, just let it go." For a moment, just a moment, she saw something human flicker in Morwen's obsidian eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or regret for the choices that had led them all to this place. Then Nyx moved, her curved blade seeking Lyra's throat with desperate speed. But the killing strike never landed. Kael's sword took the assassin witch through the heart, ending her centuries of darkness in a single, clean stroke. Morwen's scream of rage and grief shattered windows throughout the fortress. "You killed her. You killed my sister." "Your sister was already dead," Kael said quietly, his sword still dripping with Nyx's blood. "Has been for centuries. We just put her to rest." The ancient witch raised her hands, power gathering around her like a storm. But before she could strike, Vera grabbed her arm. "Enough," the beautiful witch said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "It's over, Morwen. We've lost." "Lost?" Morwen's voice cracked with hysteria. "We can still look around you." Vera gestured at the battlefield, where the shadow wolves and summoned horrors were dissolving back into nothingness without the witch's power to sustain them. "Our creatures are gone. Nyx is dead, and she nodded toward Lyra. "She's awake now, fully awake. We can't control her anymore." Morwen followed her gaze, and Lyra saw the moment when reality finally penetrated the ancient witch's fury. The weapon they had spent 10 years shaping had become something beyond their reach, something that could destroy them as easily as breathing. "This isn't over," Morwen said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes," Lyra said gently, "it is." She reached out with her power one last time, not to destroy but to sever. The bonds that connected the witches to their sources of dark magic, the threads that tied them to the pain and hatred they had fed on for so long. She cut them all, cleanly and completely. Morwen aged a century in heartbeats. her ancient flesh finally reflecting the weight of years she had cheated death to accumulate. Vera's perfect beauty cracked like old paint, revealing the weariness beneath. They were just women now, mortal, tired, finally free of the darkness that had consumed their lives. "Go," Lyra said, her voice heavy with compassion. "Find some peace before the end." They went without another word, supporting each other as they walked away from the fortress and the lives they had tried to destroy. They wouldn't live long. Their bodies were too damaged by centuries of dark magic to survive without it. But perhaps they would find some measure of peace in their final days. The battle was over. The fortress stood, and Lyra finally understood the difference between justice and vengeance. In choosing mercy over destruction, a weapon learned to become something more, not a bringer of death, but a guardian of life. The conclave gathered under the autumn moon, representatives from every major pack in the Northern Territories. Lyra stood at Kael's side in the Great Hall of Ironfang, watching as alphas and their mates filed in with careful, measured steps. Some she recognized from the old Alliance maps, leaders who had worked with Kael to build the fragile peace that now governed their lands. Others were strangers, called from distant territories by news of what had transpired at the fortress. News of the Moon Daughter who had awakened. "Nervous?" Kael asked quietly, his hand finding hers with practiced ease. "Terrified," she admitted, then smiled at his surprised expression. "But not about this, about forgetting to be terrified." It had been 3 months since the witch's final attack, 3 months of healing and rebuilding and learning to navigate the complexities of her new life. The pack had accepted her completely, not just as their alpha's mate, but as a force in her own right. The awakening of her Moon Daughter heritage had brought gifts beyond just raw power, enhanced senses, deeper connection to the natural world, and an intuitive understanding of pack dynamics that made her invaluable in negotiations. But acceptance within Ironfang was one thing. Acceptance from the broader wolf community was quite another. Alpha Draven. The voice belonged to Corvin Blackthorn, leader of the mountain packs and one of the most influential voices in the Northern Territories. He was a massive man, scarred by decades of warfare, with eyes like winter storms. "We come seeking answers." Kael inclined his head respectfully. "And I will provide them as far as I'm able." "The rumors we've heard," Corvin's gaze shifted to Lyra, frank and assessing. "They say your mate carries blood that has not walked the earth for 3 centuries. They say she single-handedly destroyed a coven of ancient witches." "The first is true," Kael replied calmly. "The second is more complicated." Murmurs rippled through the assembled alphas. Lyra could feel their mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, outright fear. Moon Daughters were legend, their power the stuff of stories told around fires on winter nights. To have one appear in modern times, bound to one of the most powerful alphas in the territories, it changed things. Everything. "Demonstrate," said Helena Silvermane, alpha of the eastern coastal packs. Her voice was sharp, challenging. "If she truly carries Moon Daughter blood, let her prove it." The request was not unexpected, but it still sent tension singing through the room. This was the test Lyra had been dreading, not just of her power, but of whether she could control it in front of witnesses who would judge every nuance of what they saw. "Helena," Kael's voice carried a warning edge, "my mate is not a performing animal to dance for your entertainment. Peace, love." Lyra stepped forward, her hand still linked with his. "They have a right to know what they're dealing with." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of wolves who held the lives of thousands in their hands. Some watched with barely concealed hunger, already calculating how her power might be used to their advantage. Others radiated suspicion, wondering if she represented a threat to the careful balance they had all worked to maintain. And a few, just a few, looked at her with something that might have been hope. "You want proof of what I am," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "Very well." She closed her eyes and reached for the power that lived in her blood, the heritage she was still learning to understand. It rose to her call like tame fire, silver light that began to gather around her hands and spread outward in gentle waves. But instead of the destructive force they might have expected, what she showed them was something else entirely. The light touched each alpha in turn, and for a moment, just a moment, they felt what she felt. The deep, abiding love she held for the pack that had claimed her. The protective instinct that would drive her to any lengths to preserve what they had built together. The bone-deep certainty that strength was meant to serve, not to dominate. When the light faded, the room remained silent for a long moment. "Moon's blood," whispered Corvin, awe replacing suspicion in his weathered features. "She's the real thing." "The question," Helena said, though her voice had lost its challenging edge, "is what you intend to do with that power." "Nothing," Lyra said simply. "Everything. I intend to protect what I love, defend those who cannot defend themselves, and help build something better than what came before." She looked around the room again, meeting each alpha's gaze in turn. "Just like all of you." "Pretty words," said Marcus Ironhold, alpha of the northern mining settlements. "But power like that, it has a way of changing people, of making them think they know better than everyone else." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra felt Kael tense beside her, felt the pack bonds singing with protective fury from the Iron Fang wolves present. But she held up a hand, asking for patience. "You're right," she said, and saw surprise flicker across several faces. "Power does change people. I've seen what it did to the witches who shaped my childhood, how it twisted them into something monstrous. I've seen what it did to Kael's father, how it made him cruel and paranoid." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I've also seen what power can become when it's tempered by love, when it's guided by wisdom instead of hunger, when it serves something greater than itself." Her hand tightened on Kael's. "My mate taught me that. He showed me what it means to be strong without being brutal, to lead without dominating, to protect without controlling." "And if that changes?" Helena asked quietly. "If the power grows beyond your ability to control it?" "Then you stop me." The words came without hesitation, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "All of you, together, because protecting the innocent is more important than any one person's life, even mine." The declaration sent another ripple of surprise through the room. It wasn't what they had expected from someone carrying legendary power, not arrogance or demands for recognition, but a willingness to be held accountable. "You would accept our judgment?" Corvin asked, his voice thoughtful. "Even if it meant your death?" "I would welcome it," Lyra replied, "because it would mean the system worked. That power truly does serve justice, instead of the other way around." Kael's fingers tightened on hers, and through the mat bond, she felt his pride and terror warring in equal measure. He understood what she was offering, not just accountability, but a fundamental shift in how supernatural power was perceived and regulated. The alphas exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Corvin stepped forward. "The mountain packs recognize Lyra Draven as alpha female of Iron Fang," he said formally, "and we accept the responsibility she has offered us." One by one, the other alphas followed suit. Not just acceptance, but partnership, a recognition that her power came with obligations that extended beyond pack boundaries. "There is one more matter," Helena said when the formal recognitions were complete. "The vacant territories left by the witch attacks. Someone needs to oversee their recovery, help the survivors rebuild." She looked directly at Lyra as she spoke, and the implication was clear. It wasn't just an offer. It was a test, a chance to prove that her words about service and protection were more than pretty speeches. "We'll do it," Lyra said, not bothering to consult with Kael. She could feel his agreement through their bond, his understanding that this was what they had been building toward all along. "Together," Kael added, his voice carrying the weight of joint commitment. "Iron Fang will provide resources, protection, whatever is needed to help those lands heal." The conclave ended with planning sessions that stretched deep into the night, discussions of supply lines and patrol routes, of refugee resettlement and territorial boundaries. Practical matters that would determine whether their grand words translated into meaningful change. But later, when the visiting alphas had been shown to their quarters and the fortress had settled into quiet, Lyra found herself on the battlements with Kael, looking out at the lands they had sworn to protect. "Regrets?" he asked, following her gaze across the moonlit valley. "About what?" about accepting responsibility for territories we've never seen, people we've never met, about binding yourself to accountability that could get you killed. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could feel the worry underneath, about choosing to serve instead of to rule. She turned to look at him, this man who had taken her hatred and transformed it into love, who had seen her darkness and chosen to kindle light instead. The moonstone collar at her throat caught the silver light, and she touched it absently, remembering the day he had offered her not just his heart but his future. None, she said softly, because this is what it means to be worthy of power, to accept that it comes with a price and to pay it gladly, even if the cost is everything, especially then. She smiled, fierce and certain and absolutely unafraid, because some things are worth any price: love, justice, the hope that tomorrow can be better than today. Kael pulled her into his arms, and she felt the solid strength of him, the steady heartbeat that had become her anchor in storms. Through the mate bond, she felt his love pour into her like liquid light, not possessive or demanding, but generous and patient and absolutely unshakable. "I love you," he said quietly. "Not the power, not the legend, not the symbol. You, the woman who chose mercy over vengeance, who chose to heal instead of to hurt. And I love you," she replied, feeling the truth of it in every cell of her body. "The Alpha, who chose to lead with his heart, who taught me that strength and kindness aren't opposites." They stood together in the moonlight, looking out at the lands they would spend their lives protecting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: refugees to settle, territories to heal, the endless work of building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found their way home to each other. Under the watching stars, an Alpha and his moon daughter mate claimed their destiny, not as rulers of wolves, but as servants of justice, guardians of hope, and keepers of the light that drives back darkness. 5 years later, Lyra stood in the ruins of her childhood home. The cellar where she had hidden as an 11-year-old girl was gone now, filled in and overgrown with wildflowers that bloomed white as moonlight. Where her family's house had once stood, a memorial garden stretched toward the mountains, stone markers bearing the names of the dead, surrounded by herbs and healing plants that would serve the new settlement growing nearby. "The children want to know if you're ready," Kael said softly, approaching through the dappled shade of the memorial grove. She turned to look at the group waiting at the garden's edge, a dozen refugee children from the reclaimed territories, eager faces bright with curiosity and hope. They had been asking for weeks to hear the story of the Vale Pack, to understand the history of the land where their new community was taking root. "Almost," she said, touching the stone that bore her parents' names. "I just need another moment." The years since the conclave had been kind to them. The vacant territories were thriving now, populated by survivors from a dozen different tragedies who had found new purpose in building something together. The settlement they called Haven had grown from a handful of refugee families to a proper town, complete with schools and markets and a healing center where Lyra taught young wolves to understand their gifts. She and Kael had made their home here, in a house that looked out over the memorial garden and the thriving community beyond. It wasn't the fortress she had once called home, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and filled with the laughter of the Pack family they had gathered around them. "Aunt Lyra?" The voice belonged to Emma, a 7-year-old whose parents had died in a rogue attack 2 winters ago. She was bold and bright and absolutely fearless, with the kind of endless curiosity that made her a favorite among the settlement's adults. "Are you sad?" "No, little one." Lyra knelt beside the girl, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "Just remembering." "Good remembering or bad remembering?" "Both." Lyra smiled, touched by the child's earnest concern. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. At 7, she had already learned that the world contained both beauty and sorrow, often in the same moment. "Will you tell us about the girl in the cellar now?" asked Thomas, Emma's older brother. "About how she learned to be brave?" "She was always brave," Lyra corrected gently, standing and taking their hands. "She just had to learn what to do with her courage." She led the group to the circle of smooth stones where they gathered for story time, setting beneath the shade of an ancient oak that had somehow survived the fire that claimed everything else. The children arranged themselves around her with the practiced ease of those who knew this ritual well. Once upon a time, Lyra began, using the traditional opening that never failed to capture their attention, there was a little girl who lost everything in a single night. She told them the story as she always did, not sanitized for young ears, but not dwelling on the darkest details either. The children knew about loss, about tragedy, about the way the world could change in a heartbeat. What they needed to learn was how to survive it without letting it define them. The girl made a promise in the ashes, Lyra continued, her voice soft in the afternoon air, a promise to make the bad wolves pay for what they had done. And she spent many years learning to keep that promise. But promises can change, Emma said, anticipating the turn in the story that was her favorite part. Yes, they can, especially when we learn new things about ourselves and the world around us. Lyra's fingers found the moonstone collar at her throat, still there after all these years. The girl learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose a different path than the one you started on. Even if people don't understand? Asked Sarah, a quiet 10-year-old whose pack had been destroyed by disease. Especially then. Lyra's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, because choosing your own path means accepting responsibility for where it leads, and that's what makes you strong. Not the power you carry, but the choices you make with it. She told them about the witches and the fortress, about learning to love someone she had been taught to hate, about discovering that strength could be gentle, that leadership could serve, that the greatest victory was sometimes choosing not to fight at all. What happened to the witches? Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. They found peace, eventually, the kind that comes at the end of things. Lyra's voice was gentle, touched with the compassion that had grown stronger over the years. Because everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moments. Even bad wolves? Even bad wolves. Though that doesn't mean we let them hurt people while they're learning to be better. The children nodded sagely, working through the complexities of justice and mercy that would guide their own choices someday. They lived in a world where such distinctions mattered, where the difference between punishment and revenge could determine the fate of entire communities. Tell us about the Moon Daughter Awakening, Emma said, bouncing slightly with excitement. This was always her favorite part of the story. Lyra smiled and let a thread of power shine through her words, making them glitter like starlight in the afternoon shade. The children gasped with delight, reaching out to touch the silver light that danced around their storyteller's hands. The girl discovered that she had been carrying magic in her blood all along, Lyra said, letting the light play between her fingers. But magic is like courage. It's not about how much you have, but what you choose to do with it. And she chose to heal instead of hurt, the children chorused, familiar with this part of the tale. She chose love instead of hate. She chose to build instead of destroy. And what did she learn? Lyra asked, though she knew they knew the answer. That the strongest magic of all is choosing to be kind when the world gives you every reason not to be, Emma recited proudly. That's right. Lyra gathered the silver light back into herself, feeling the warm contentment that came from sharing wisdom with the next generation. And that's how the girl in the cellar became the woman who survived. Not by winning every fight, but by choosing which fights were worth having. The story ended as it always did, with the children asking questions and sharing their own thoughts about courage and choice and the differences between justice and revenge. They were bright children, these survivors, tempered by loss but not broken by it. They would grow up to be leaders and healers and protectors in their own right. As the sun began to set, painting the memorial garden in shades of gold and amber, the children returned to their families for dinner. Lyra remained by the oak tree, watching the lights come on in the settlement windows, listening to the sounds of community life settling into evening rhythms. Good story? Kael asked, settling beside her on the grass. True story. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had anchored her through every storm. Mostly. What parts did you leave out? The parts about being afraid, about not knowing if we were making the right choices, about waking up some mornings and wondering if we were strong enough for what the day would bring. The human parts. The human parts, she agreed. They'll learn about those soon enough. For now, they need to believe that courage and kindness are always rewarded, that good choices lead to good outcomes. And when they're older, we'll teach them that courage and kindness are rewards in themselves, that good choices are worth making even when, especially when, they're difficult. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered around them, watching the memorial garden fade into shadow. Somewhere in the settlement, a baby was crying. Somewhere else, teenagers were laughing over some shared joke. Life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity. "Any regrets?" Kael asked, echoing the question he had posed years ago on the fortress battlements. Lyra considered the question seriously, looking back over the path that had brought them here. The broken child in the cellar, the weapon forged by hatred, the woman who had learned to choose love over vengeance. All of it had led to this moment, this place, this life they had built from the ashes of what had been destroyed. "Only one," she said finally. "What's that?" She turned to look at him, this man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, who had taught her that strength and gentleness could coexist, who had spent 5 years proving that some promises were worth keeping forever, that it took me so long to understand that the best victories are the ones where nobody has to lose. Kael's smile was soft, touched with the kind of happiness that came from years of shared purpose and deepening love. We had to learn that together. Neither of us could have figured it out alone. "No," she agreed, settling more comfortably against his side. "But we did figure it out. Eventually." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, wolves began their evening songs, not the lonely howls of rogues or the war cries of raiders, but the complex harmonies of community, of pack bonds strengthened by choice rather than fear. Lyra closed her eyes and listened to the music of home, feeling the mate bond hum with contentment between them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, refugees to settle, territories to patrol, the endless work of building something better. But tonight, she was simply a woman sitting with the man she loved, surrounded by the community they had helped create. The girl in the cellar had made a promise in blood and ash, a vow of vengeance that had shaped a decade of her life. But the woman she had become had learned to make different promises, to protect rather than destroy, to heal rather than hurt, to build rather than burn. And in keeping those newer, better promises, she had found something the broken child had never dared dream of. She had found peace. "I came to end him, but instead, I became his reason to begin again."